Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead to the biggest miracles. On a muddy street in a fading mountain town, a woman in her 50s sees what others overlook, a tiny donkey nobody wants. The locals laugh when she pays 50 cents for the scrawny creature, calling her foolish for caring about strays. She leads him into the wilderness, wanting only to give him a safe home. But this little donkey has an unusual gift. He knows paths through the mountains that no map has ever shown. Day by day, he guides her to places long forgotten, where secrets have been waiting in silence. What starts as simple compassion becomes something extraordinary. The woman who was once mocked by her neighbors is about to discover treasures beyond imagination. But what ancient mystery could a 50-cent donkey possibly know that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Camden had always believed that life's most meaningful moments came wrapped in the simplest packages. Standing in the cramped livestock pen behind Miller's feed store, watching the small brown donkey huddle against the wooden slats, she felt that familiar tug in her chest, the same feeling that had led her to rescue countless strays over the years. The donkey couldn't have weighed more than 200 pounds, his ribs visible beneath a coat dulled by neglect. His ears drooped forward, as if the weight of the world rested on his narrow shoulders. When Dorothy extended her weathered hand through the fence, he lifted his head with cautious hope. Dark eyes, reflecting an intelligence that seemed far too profound for such a small creature. "Nobody's gonna buy that runt," called out Jake Miller from behind the counter, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a man who'd seen too many hard seasons. "Been here 3 weeks now, eating more than he's worth." Dorothy had driven down from her cabin specifically to pick up feed for her chickens, not to adopt another mouth to feed. At 54, she lived on a careful budget, stretching her late husband's modest life insurance and her occasional freelance consulting work as far as they would go. Frank had been gone 3 years now, and she'd grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of mountain life. Just her, the chickens, and the endless wilderness that surrounded her small homestead. But there was something about this donkey that spoke to her in a language deeper than words. Frank would have understood. During their 27 years of marriage, he'd never questioned her tendency to bring home wounded creatures. A geologist by training and a gentle soul by nature, he'd helped her nurse countless animals back to health in their small barn. He'd been the one to build the expanded chicken coop when she'd rescued a dozen hens from a failing farm. He'd been the one to fashion a splint for the 3-legged cat that still prowled their property. And he'd been the one to quietly pay the veterinary bills without ever making her feel guilty about the expense. The memory of Frank's calloused hands gently holding an injured sparrow brought tears to Dorothy's eyes. He died in a mining accident, a cave-in at the copper mine, where he'd worked as a safety inspector. The irony wasn't lost on her that a man who'd spent his career preventing such accidents had become victim to the very danger he'd tried to eliminate. The settlement had been modest, enough to pay off their cabin and leave her with a small cushion, but not enough for grand gestures or expensive rescues. Yet here she stood, digging through her worn leather purse for the 50 cents Jake was asking. "You sure about this, Dorothy?" Jake's voice had softened, losing its earlier edge. He'd known Frank, had gone to school with him, and he understood the loneliness that could drive a person to make impractical decisions. "He's awful small. Might not even be healthy." Dorothy counted out 2 quarters, their surfaces worn smooth by countless transactions. These coins had bought her a loaf of bread just yesterday, but something in the donkey's eyes told her they'd be better spent here. "Sometimes the smallest things have the biggest hearts," she said, pressing the coins into Jake's palm. The transaction felt momentous despite its simplicity. Jake unlocked the pen, and the donkey stepped out with careful dignity, as if he understood that his life had just taken a significant turn. Dorothy had brought a lead rope, hoping against hope that her instincts would prove right. The donkey accepted the halter without protest, standing perfectly still, as she adjusted the straps around his delicate head. "What you gonna call him?" Jake asked, his gruff exterior unable to completely hide his curiosity. Dorothy studied the donkey's intelligent eyes, noting how they seemed to focus on something beyond the immediate surroundings, as if he could see paths that remained invisible to her. "Buster," she decided. "He looks like a fighter to me." The walk back to her truck provided the first glimpse of Buster's unusual nature. Instead of following obediently behind her, he walked beside her with purposeful steps, occasionally pausing to examine rocks or geological formations that Dorothy herself would have overlooked. When they reached her old Ford pickup, Buster stepped into the trailer without hesitation, settling himself with the confidence of an experienced traveler. The drive up the winding mountain road to her cabin gave Dorothy time to wonder what she'd gotten herself into. Frank's geological journals lay scattered across the passenger seat, thick notebooks filled with his careful observations about mineral deposits, rock formations, and the geological history of their beloved mountains. She'd been reading through them lately, trying to feel closer to him, trying to understand the landscape that had claimed his life but also shaped their happiness. The journals revealed Frank's deep respect for the land. His notes weren't just scientific observations, but almost poetic descriptions of how water-carved canyons over millennia, how pressure and time transformed simple minerals into precious stones, how the mountains held secrets that would take lifetimes to uncover. Reading his words, Dorothy felt like she was seeing the landscape through his eyes, every rock formation telling a story, every creek bed holding clues to ancient processes. Her cabin sat on 40 acres of mixed forest and meadow, purchased decades ago when land was affordable and their dreams were large. Frank had built most of it himself, adding rooms as their needs changed, crafting custom shelves for his rock collections and her books. The property backed up against national forest land, providing endless hiking trails and the kind of solitude that city dwellers paid thousands to experience for a week. Buster stepped out of the trailer and immediately began exploring his new home with systematic thoroughness. Dorothy watched him investigate the chicken coop, the small barn, and the vegetable garden with the focus of a surveyor mapping new territory. The chickens, accustomed to various animal visitors over the years, regarded him with mild interest before returning to their eternal search for bugs and seeds. What struck Dorothy most was how Buster moved across the landscape. While her previous rescues had needed time to adjust, exploring their new environment with the tentative steps of displaced creatures, Buster moved like he belonged here. More than that, he moved like he knew where he was going. That evening, as Dorothy sat on her front porch with a cup of tea and one of Frank's journals, she watched Buster graze in the meadow below. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose, the same colors that had drawn her and Frank to this place so many years ago. In the distance, the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range stood like ancient sentinels. Holding their secrets close, Buster raised his head from the grass and looked directly at her, those dark eyes reflecting something that made her heart skip. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw Frank's gentle smile in the donkey's expression, that same patient knowing that had made her husband such a gifted observer of the natural world. The mountains seemed to whisper approval in the evening breeze, and Dorothy felt a stirring of anticipation she hadn't experienced since Frank's death. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take Buster for a proper exploration of the trails they knew so well. She had no way of knowing that this simple decision would change everything she thought she understood about the land she called home. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Dorothy closed Frank's journal and headed inside, feeling more hopeful than she had in months. In the meadow below, Buster continued grazing, but his attention seemed focused on something far beyond the grass at his feet, something hidden in the mountains that surrounded them, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn when Dorothy clipped the lead rope to Buster's halter for their first real adventure together. She'd packed light, Just water, some trail mix, and one of Frank's geological journals in case they encountered anything interesting. The familiar weight of her small backpack felt comforting as they set out on what she assumed would be a gentle introduction to the mountain trails. Buster had other plans. Entirely, instead of following the well-worn path that led to Eagle's Rest, a moderate hike Dorothy had taken countless times with Frank, Buster pulled steadily toward a barely visible deer trail that branched off through dense aspen groves. Dorothy had noticed this faint track before, but had never bothered to explore it. It looked like it would peter out after a few hundred yards, leading nowhere in particular. "Come on, Buster," she coaxed gently, tugging the rope toward the main trail. "Let's start with something easier." But Buster planted his small hooves with surprising determination, his ears forward and alert, focused on something Dorothy couldn't see or hear. When she tried again to guide him toward the familiar path, he actually backed up a few steps, then looked at her with such clear intent that she found herself laughing despite her frustration. "You really want to go that way, don't you?" His response was to take a deliberate step toward the deer trail, pausing to look back at her as if to say, "Are you coming or not?" Dorothy had learned over the years to trust animal instincts. Frank had often joked that creatures knew things humans had forgotten how to perceive. Against her better judgment, she followed Buster into the aspens, expecting to turn back within minutes when the trail inevitably disappeared. But the trail didn't disappear. If anything, it became more defined as they climbed, winding between granite boulders and through meadows Dorothy had never seen, despite living here for over 2 decades. The path showed signs of ancient use, worn smooth in places, with carefully placed stones that seemed too deliberately arranged to be natural. An hour into their unexpected journey, they emerged onto a rocky ridge Dorothy didn't recognize. The view was spectacular, offering perspectives of the surrounding peaks that no official trail provided. But what captured her attention wasn't the scenery, it was the carefully constructed pile of stones that sat like a miniature monument on the highest point of the ridge. Dorothy had seen plenty of trail cairns before, the rock piles hikers built to mark paths or commemorate their passage. This was different. The stones were weathered smooth, clearly much older than casual trail markers. They'd been selected for size and color, fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of deliberate purpose rather than spontaneous construction. Buster walked directly to the cairn and stopped, lowering his head as if paying respect to something sacred. Dorothy followed, her geological training automatically analyzing the stones. They weren't local. At least 3 different types of rock, including what looked like quartzite that would have come from miles away. Someone had transported these stones here with specific intent. "What do you think, Frank?" she whispered to the wind, a habit she'd developed since his death. "What would you make of this?" As if in answer, a sudden gust scattered the aspen leaves around the cairn, and Dorothy noticed something that made her heart race. Partially hidden beneath decades of accumulated forest debris was a flat stone, bearing what looked like carved markings. She knelt carefully, brushing away dirt and pine needles with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering ancient artifacts. The markings were faint but definitely artificial, not random scratches but deliberate symbols carved into the stone's surface. They looked like arrows or directional indicators, pointing deeper into the wilderness. Dorothy opened Frank's journal, comparing the unknown symbols to his detailed sketches of geological formations and mineral indicators. Nothing matched exactly, but something about the precision of the carvings reminded her of the surveyor's marks Frank had taught her to recognize, the kinds of indicators mining operations used to mark claims and boundaries. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to emphasize the carved arrows. Dorothy found herself studying the landscape in the direction they pointed, noting features she would have missed without this new focus. There, another ridge barely visible through the trees. And there, what might be another pile of stones, too far away to be certain, but positioned exactly where the arrows seemed to indicate. Buster watched her with patient intelligence, as if he understood the significance of her discovery and was waiting for her to reach the same conclusion he'd already drawn. When she finally stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, he was already facing the direction indicated by the arrows. "You knew this was here, didn't you?" she asked him. "Somehow you knew exactly where to bring me." The walk back to the cabin felt different, charged with possibility and questions that had no easy answers. Dorothy's mind raced with theories and explanations, each more intriguing than the last. Who had built that cairn? When? And why did Buster seem to know exactly where it was located? That evening, she spread Frank's geological surveys across her kitchen table, searching for any reference to the ridge they'd visited. The official topographical maps showed the area as unexplored wilderness, but Frank's personal notes were more detailed. In the margins of a 1998 survey, she found a barely legible notation: "Anomalous rock formations. Investigate further." The words sent a chill down her spine. Frank had known there was something unusual about that area, but apparently had never followed up on his observation. Life had gotten in the way: work demands, family obligations, the routine responsibilities that fill up years without our notice. Now, 25 years later, a 50-cent donkey had led her directly to whatever Frank had noticed, but never had time to explore. Dorothy stayed up late that night, poring over every journal, every map, every sketch Frank had made of the surrounding mountains. The more she read, the more convinced she became that the cairn was just the beginning, a marker pointing towards something larger and more significant. Frank's geological knowledge, combined with her own growing excitement, painted a picture of possibilities that made sleep impossible. Outside her window, Buster stood quietly in the moonlit meadow, his silhouette dark against the silver grass. Even from this distance, Dorothy could see that he was facing the mountains, alert and watchful, as if he could sense things moving in the darkness that remained invisible to human perception. Tomorrow, she decided, they would follow those arrows wherever they led. Frank would have wanted her to investigate, to pursue the mystery he'd noted but never solved. And something told her that Buster wouldn't rest until she understood what he'd brought her to find. The mountains kept their secrets in the darkness, but Dorothy felt certain that dawn would bring the beginning of discoveries that would change everything she thought. She knew about the wilderness she called home. The drive down to Millbrook's County Courthouse felt different this time. Charged with purpose rather than routine, Dorothy had made this trip dozens of times over the years, paying property taxes, renewing permits, handling the mundane paperwork that came with mountain living. But today she carried Frank's journals and a growing conviction that yesterday's discovery was just the beginning of something much larger. Martha Hendricks had worked the county records office for 37 years, and her institutional memory was legendary among locals. If anyone would know about historical surveys or mining claims in Dorothy's area, it would be Martha. The older woman looked up from her filing with genuine pleasure when Dorothy approached the counter. "Well, Dorothy Camden, haven't seen you down here in months. How are you managing up there on your own?" "Getting by just fine, Martha. Actually, I'm hoping you might help me with some research. I'm trying to trace the survey history for the area around my property, specifically the wilderness sections that back up to national forest land." Martha's eyes lit up with interest. "Historical research is my favorite kind of work. Much more interesting than processing building permits all day. What exactly are you looking for?" Dorothy spread one of Frank's topographical maps on the counter, pointing to the ridge where she'd found the cairn. "This area here. I found some old markers yesterday, stone cairns and carved symbols that look like they might be survey indicators. Frank made notes about unusual rock formations in that vicinity, but I'd like to know if anyone ever filed official claims or conducted geological surveys there." "Give me a few minutes," Martha said, disappearing into the maze of filing cabinets that lined the back wall. "We have survey records going back to territorial days, though some of the older ones are in pretty rough condition." While Martha searched, Dorothy studied the other maps and documents displayed around the office. Millbrook had been a thriving mining town in the 1920s and 1930s. but most of the operations had focused on copper and silver extraction in the valleys, not the higher elevation wilderness areas where she'd found the cairn. Martha returned carrying a cardboard box and several rolled documents, her expression excited. "You've stumbled onto something interesting, Dorothy. Look at this, a geological survey from 1932, filed by a prospector named Jake Morrison. The survey area includes exactly the section you're asking about. The survey map was water-damaged and fragile, but Dorothy could make out the careful notations and elevation markers. Morrison had been thorough, documenting not just mineral potential, but also topographical features, water sources, and access routes. Most intriguingly, his map showed the exact location of the stone cairn Dorothy had discovered, marked with the notation Trail Marker No. 1. Trail Marker No. 1, Dorothy repeated. "That implies there were others." "That's what I was thinking," Martha agreed. "And look at this. Morrison filed for a mining claim covering nearly 200 acres in that area. But here's the interesting part. The claim was abandoned after only 6 months, and Morrison disappeared that winter. Local folklore says he went crazy from isolation, but some folks believed he'd found something significant and was keeping it secret." Dorothy's pulse quickened as she studied Morrison's detailed drawings. The man had clearly been educated, possibly trained as a surveyor or geologist. His sketches showed rock formations and mineral indicators with the kind of precision Frank would have admired. But there were also strange annotations, references to protected, cache, and environmental preservation that seemed unusual for a typical mining operation. Did Morrison ever file any assayer's reports? Any documentation of what he found? Martha pulled out a manila folder. "This is everything we have." Morrison was secretive about his work, but he did file one preliminary report with the mining registrar. "It's been sitting in our files for 90 years. The assayer's report made Dorothy's hands tremble. Morrison had submitted ore samples showing exceptionally high gold content, not just traces, but concentrations that would indicate a significant deposit. The estimated value, calculated in $1932, was substantial enough to make any prospector wealthy. Why would he abandon such a valuable claim? Dorothy wondered aloud. "That's where the mystery gets interesting," Martha said, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidential secret. "My grandmother worked here back then, and she always said Morrison was different from other prospectors. He seemed more interested in protecting the land than exploiting it. Some people thought he was touched in the head, but Grandma believed he had principles that conflicted with getting rich quick." Dorothy photographed every document with her phone, making sure to capture Morrison's detailed maps and sketches. The more she learned about the mysterious prospector, the more his story resonated with her own values. Frank had always taught her that the mountains deserved respect, not just exploitation. Is there any way to determine if Morrison's claim is still legally valid? Martha consulted another ledger. Claims abandoned for more than 90 days automatically revert to public domain, unless specific renewal procedures are followed. Morrison never filed renewals, so the land is technically available for new claims. But it's mostly within national forest boundaries now, which complicates things. Driving back up the mountain, Dorothy's mind raced with possibilities and questions. Morrison had clearly found something valuable in 1932, but his decision to abandon the claim suggested motivations beyond simple profit. His references to environmental preservation were decades ahead of their time, the kind of forward-thinking conservation ethic that wouldn't become mainstream until the 1970s. The most intriguing aspect was how Morrison's trail markers aligned perfectly with Buster's instinctive navigation. Could it be mere coincidence that a 50-cent donkey had led her directly to a 90-year-old mystery? Or was there something deeper at work, some kind of inherited knowledge passed down through generations of animals that had worked these mountains? Back at the cabin, Dorothy spread Morrison's maps alongside Frank's geological surveys, looking for connections and patterns. The similarities were striking, Both men had noted the same geological anomalies, the same mineral indicators, the same unusual rock formations. Frank had been on the verge of discovering what Morrison had found decades earlier. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her kitchen table, Dorothy made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Tomorrow, she would return to the mountains with metal detecting equipment and proper surveying tools. If Morrison had left a trail of markers leading to his discovery, she was going to follow that trail to its end. Outside, Buster grazed peacefully in the meadow, but Dorothy noticed he kept raising his head to look toward the distant peaks, as if he could sense something calling from the wilderness. Something that had been waiting patiently for nearly a century to be found by someone worthy of its secrets. Dorothy's metal detector had been gathering dust in the barn since Frank's death. He'd bought it years ago during a brief phase of prospecting enthusiasm, back when gold prices were climbing and retirement seemed more uncertain than it did now. She'd forgotten how heavy the device was until she strapped it across her shoulders alongside her hiking pack, preparing for what felt like the most important expedition of her life. Buster waited patiently while she adjusted straps and checked equipment, but his body language conveyed urgency. Ears forward, weight shifted toward the mountain. Every line of his small frame focused on the invisible trail. Only he seemed to understand. When she finally clipped the lead rope to his halter, he immediately headed toward the same deer path that had led them to the first cairn. The morning mist clung to the aspen groves as they climbed, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that seemed appropriate for their mission. Dorothy found herself walking differently today, paying attention to details she'd previously overlooked, the way certain rocks were arranged, the subtle variations in vegetation that might indicate different soil conditions, the places where water had carved unusual patterns into the landscape. An hour into their hike, Buster led her off the previous day's route, following what appeared to be an even fainter trail through dense undergrowth. Dorothy's confidence wavered as branches caught at her clothes, and the path seemed to disappear entirely. But Buster moved with such certainty that she forced herself to trust his judgment. They emerged into a small clearing she'd never seen before, dominated by a massive granite boulder that stood like a natural monument. Buster walked directly to the base of the boulder and stopped, looking back at Dorothy with unmistakable expectation. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked him. "This is what you wanted to show me." She activated the metal detector and began a systematic sweep around the boulder's base. Almost immediately, the device began chirping with increasing intensity. Dorothy's heart raced as she narrowed down the signal to a spot where the granite met the forest floor, partially hidden by decades of accumulated pine needles and organic debris. Kneeling carefully, she began clearing away the natural litter. 6 inches down, her fingers encountered something hard and metallic. Working patiently, she unearthed a dented but intact gold pan, the kind prospectors had used for over a century. The pan was old, its surface darkened by time and weather, but clearly well-made and carefully maintained. "Oh my goodness," Dorothy whispered, cradling the pan like a precious artifact. "Buster, this belonged to Morrison, didn't it?" The metal detector continued chirping as she expanded her search. Within an hour, she'd uncovered a small cache of prospecting tools. A pickhead, a sieve, several sample containers, and most remarkably, a waterproof pouch containing what appeared to be maps and documents. Dorothy's hands shook as she carefully extracted the contents of the pouch. Morrison had prepared for the possibility that someone would eventually follow his trail. The papers included detailed sketches of the surrounding terrain, with arrows indicating the direction to subsequent markers, and most intriguingly, a letter written in a careful script on paper that had somehow survived 9 decades in the wilderness. To whoever follows the markers, the letter began, "Know that you walk in the footsteps of one who loved this land more than gold itself. The treasure you seek is real, but the true wealth lies in understanding why it must be protected rather than plundered." Morrison's letter continued with specific instructions for finding the next marker. but also with warnings about the responsibility that came with knowledge. He wrote about the conflict between immediate profit and long-term stewardship, about the need to preserve wilderness for future generations, about the danger of allowing greed to destroy irreplaceable natural beauty. "I have seen what mining operations do to pristine country," Morrison had written. "The treasure I found could make a man wealthy, but it could also destroy everything I've grown to love about these mountains. The markers I leave behind are for someone who will understand the difference between having wealth and being worthy of it." Dorothy read the letter twice, each word resonating with her own growing understanding of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about finding gold. It was about proving worthy of a legacy that Morrison had protected for nearly a century. As she packed up the artifacts, Dorothy noticed Buster's behavior had changed. His ears were constantly moving, swiveling to catch sounds she couldn't hear. When she looked in the direction of his attention, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, too deliberate to be wildlife, too distant to identify clearly. The walk back to the cabin felt different, marked by a growing sense that they were no longer alone in the wilderness. Twice, Dorothy heard the distant sound of engines, ATVs or motorcycles, in areas where motorized vehicles weren't permitted. When they reached a ridge with a clear view of the valley below, she spotted dust clouds along some of the old mining roads that supposedly hadn't been used in decades. That evening, Dorothy called her sister Linda in Denver, needing to share her discoveries with someone who would understand their significance. Linda had always been the practical one, the accountant who dealt in facts and figures rather than dreams and possibilities. "Dorothy, you need to be careful," Linda said after hearing about the gold pan and Morrison's letter. "If word gets out about potential gold deposits, you'll have every fortune hunter in Colorado tramping through your property." "But Linda, this isn't about getting rich quick." Morrison was trying to protect something important. "That's very noble, but 90-year-old prospectors aren't the only ones interested in gold. Modern mining operations have equipment that can strip an entire mountainside in months. If there's really significant gold up there, you need legal protection before word spreads." The conversation left Dorothy with more questions than answers. How could she honor Morrison's vision of stewardship while navigating the modern realities of mineral rights and legal claims? How could she protect the wilderness she loved while pursuing the mystery that Buster had led her to discover? As night fell over the mountains, Dorothy sat on her porch with Morrison's letter and Frank's geological journals, trying to piece together a plan that would satisfy both her curiosity and her conscience. In the meadow below, Buster grazed peacefully, but she noticed he kept raising his head to look toward the dark silhouettes of the peaks, as if he could sense something approaching through the wilderness, something that would soon force her to make decisions she wasn't ready to face. Dorothy's next trip to the courthouse felt urgent in a way her previous research hadn't. Morrison's letter had provided coordinates for the third marker, but it had also warned about those who would destroy for profit what should be preserved for posterity. As she spread the new documents across Martha's counter, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. "You've been busy," Martha observed, examining the photographs of Morrison's artifacts. "This is remarkable, like opening a time capsule from the Depression era." "Martha, I need to understand the legal situation. If Morrison's claim was abandoned, what would prevent someone else from filing a new claim on the same land?" Martha pulled out several thick binders. "That's where things get complicated. In 1932, mining law was much simpler. File a claim, work the land, maintain the boundaries. But modern regulations are entirely different, especially on Forest Service land. Environmental impact studies, endangered species surveys, water rights assessments. The process can take years. But someone could still file a claim?" "Absolutely. In fact, there's been increased activity lately. Rick Dalton's construction company has filed preliminary surveys for several areas around here. Officially, they're looking for gravel deposits for road projects, but word is they're really interested in precious metals." Dorothy felt her stomach drop. Rick Dalton was known throughout the county as a man who valued profit over everything else. His company had a reputation for completing projects quickly and cheaply, regardless of environmental consequences. If Dalton learned about Morrison's discovery, the pristine wilderness would become an industrial operation within months. How much does Dalton know about Morrison's old claim? Hard to say, but he's been asking questions. Last week he requested copies of all geological surveys from the 1930s. I had to provide them. They're public records, but I didn't like the way he studied those maps. Martha pulled out a recent filing. Look at this. Dalton submitted an application for mineral rights exploration on nearly 500 acres of Forest Service land. The boundaries include your property line and extend well into the area Morrison was working. Dorothy studied Dalton's maps with growing alarm. His proposed survey area encompassed not just Morrison's old claim, but also the ridge where she'd found the first cairn and the clearing where Buster had led her to the buried tools. If Dalton's application was approved, he'd have legal authority to bring heavy equipment into the wilderness, conducting exploratory surveys that could destroy Morrison's carefully hidden trail forever. How long do I have before his application is processed? Forest Service reviews take 60 to 90 days, but there's a public comment period first. You could file an objection, but you'd need grounds, environmental concerns, archaeological significance, something substantial. Dorothy left the courthouse with copies of all relevant documents and a growing sense of urgency. Morrison had spent months carefully hiding his discovery to protect it from exactly this kind of industrial exploitation. Now, 90 years later, his worst fears were about to be realized unless she could find a way to stop them. The drive back to her cabin took longer than usual because she kept checking her rearview mirror. Twice, she noticed the same dark pickup truck following at a discreet distance, but when she turned onto her private road, the truck continued past without slowing. Still, something about the timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. Buster was waiting by the gate when she arrived, his body language tense and alert. Instead of his usual casual greeting, he moved immediately toward her truck, pressing his nose against her hand with unusual urgency. When she tried to unload her research materials, he stepped into her path, clearly agitated about something. "What is it, Buster? What's wrong?" Following his gaze toward the cabin, Dorothy noticed immediately what had disturbed him. Her front door was slightly ajar. Not much, just enough to indicate that someone had been inside. She always locked the door when leaving, a habit developed during years of living alone in an isolated area. Dorothy's heart pounded as she approached the cabin cautiously. The door showed no signs of forced entry, but the lock mechanism looked like it had been expertly manipulated. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance, but Dorothy's attention to detail revealed the subtle signs of intrusion. Books moved slightly on shelves, papers not quite where she'd left them, Frank's geological journals arranged in a different order. Someone had searched her home with professional thoroughness, looking for something specific while trying to avoid detection. But what could they have been seeking? Morrison's letter and artifacts were in her truck, and Frank's journals contained nothing about gold deposits or mining claims. Then she realized what was missing. The topographical maps she'd spread across her kitchen table, the ones showing Morrison's claim boundaries and the locations where she'd found the artifacts, were gone. Whoever had broken in knew exactly what they were looking for and had taken only what they needed. Dorothy's hands shook as she called the county sheriff's office, but she knew the response would be predictable. No valuable items stolen, no obvious property damage, no witnesses in an area where neighbors were miles away. The deputy who eventually arrived was polite but skeptical, suggesting that Dorothy might have simply misplaced the maps or forgotten to lock her door. "Ma'am, we get calls like this pretty regularly from folks living alone in remote areas. Sometimes people just feel spooked when there's no real reason for concern. Maybe you should consider getting a security system." After the deputy left, Dorothy sat on her porch with Buster, trying to make sense of what had happened. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone knew about her research, knew about Morrison's discovery, and was moving to stay ahead of her investigation. But who? And how had they learned about her activities so quickly? Buster pressed against her leg, offering comfort in his quiet way. Looking into his intelligent eyes, Dorothy realized that her 50-cent rescue had become her most valuable ally in a situation that was growing more dangerous by the hour. Tomorrow, she decided, they would continue following Morrison's trail regardless of who might be watching. She owed it to Morrison's memory, to Frank's scientific curiosity, and to the wilderness itself to see this mystery through to its conclusion. But first, she needed to take precautions. Dorothy moved Frank's remaining journals to a safe deposit box in town, photographed Morrison's letter and artifacts from multiple angles, and sent copies of everything to Linda in Denver with instructions to contact authorities if anything happened to her. As darkness settled over the mountains, Dorothy double-checked every lock and drew the curtains tight. In the barn, she prepared emergency supplies, food, water, camping gear, and Morrison's artifacts, in case they needed to leave quickly. She had the unsettling feeling that her quiet mountain life was about to become much more complicated, and that Buster's mysterious knowledge might be the only thing standing between Morrison's legacy and those who would destroy it for profit. Dorothy woke before dawn to the sound of Buster's urgent braying, a sound she'd never heard from him before. Through her bedroom window, she could see his silhouette in the meadow, head raised and ears alert, facing the mountains like a sentinel detecting approaching danger. The pre-dawn darkness seemed heavier than usual, pregnant with tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. She dressed quickly and grabbed her emergency pack, trusting Buster's instincts more than her own rational mind. Outside, the air carried the distant rumble of heavy engines, too early for legitimate Forest Service work, too coordinated to be recreational vehicles. Someone was moving equipment up the old mining roads under cover of darkness. Buster came to her immediately, pressing his nose against her palm in a gesture that had become their signal for urgent communication. When she clipped the lead rope to his halter, he didn't head toward their usual trail, but instead led her directly into the dense forest behind her cabin, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail she'd never noticed. They climbed through thick undergrowth for nearly an hour before emerging onto a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the valleys below. What Dorothy saw made her blood run cold. A convoy of trucks and heavy equipment was making its way up the old Esperanza mine road. Dozers, excavators, and what looked like core drilling equipment. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, she could see the distinctive logo of Dalton Construction on the vehicle doors. "They're not waiting for permits," Dorothy whispered to Buster. "They're moving in while they think no one's watching." From this vantage point, she could see their destination, the ridge where she'd found Morrison's first cairn. Dalton's crew was heading directly for the location marked on the map stolen from her cabin. Somehow, they'd connected her research to Morrison's discovery and decided to claim it for themselves before she could establish any legal protection. Buster tugged at the lead rope, drawing her attention away from the convoy towards something else. Following his gaze, Dorothy spotted a second group moving through the forest on foot. 4 men in camouflage carrying surveying equipment and metal detectors. They were approaching the clearing where she'd found Morrison's buried tools, moving with the coordinated precision of professionals. Dorothy's mind raced through her options. She could return to the cabin and call the sheriff, but by the time anyone responded, Dalton's crew would be established on the site with equipment that would take days to remove. She could try to reach the Forest Service directly, but their offices wouldn't open for hours. Most frustratingly, she had no legal standing to stop them. Morrison's old claim had been abandoned, and her own discoveries were on public land, but Buster seemed to have a different plan entirely. Instead of heading back toward the cabin, he began descending the far side of the ridge, following what Dorothy gradually realized was another section of Morrison's original trail. The prospector had been thorough in his route planning, creating multiple approaches to his markers that would allow access, even if the primary paths were blocked. They reached Morrison's third marker just as the eastern sky began showing the first hints of dawn. This cairn was larger than the others, built into a natural rock formation that provided both concealment and a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Hidden within the stones, Dorothy found another waterproof pouch containing Morrison's most detailed maps and what appeared to be his final letter. "If you have reached this point," Morrison had written, "then you understand that the treasure is both real and endangered. The next marker will lead you to the main cache, but beware, others will soon follow who care nothing for preservation or stewardship. The land itself will test your worthiness." Morrison's final map showed the location of his primary discovery, but it also included detailed warnings about unstable terrain, underground streams, and the need for careful approach. Most importantly, it indicated that the main deposit was hidden in a way that would require patience and respect for the natural environment to access safely. The sound of approaching engines grew louder as Dalton's convoy reached the first ridge. Through the trees, Dorothy could see the men with metal detectors beginning their systematic search of the area where she'd found Morrison's tools. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the same trail she and Buster had been following. "We have to get there first," Dorothy told Buster. Morrison trusted whoever would follow his markers. "We can't let them destroy what he spent his life protecting." Buster's response was to set off immediately along the final section of trail, moving with even greater urgency than before. The path led through increasingly rugged terrain, across boulder fields, through narrow canyon passages, and along ledges that required careful navigation. Dorothy realized that Morrison had deliberately chosen the most challenging route possible, ensuring that only someone truly committed to the journey would reach the final destination. Behind them, the sound of chainsaws echoed through the forest as Dalton's crew began clearing vegetation to make room for their heavy equipment. The destruction was beginning even before they'd found what they were looking for, confirming Morrison's worst fears about industrial mining operations. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Dorothy felt a growing connection to the long-dead prospector who'd walked these same paths nearly a century ago. Morrison had faced the same choice she was confronting: personal wealth versus environmental protection, immediate gain versus long-term stewardship. His decision to hide rather than exploit his discovery was beginning to seem not just noble, but prophetic. The final marker appeared just as the morning sun crested the eastern peaks, casting golden light across a hidden valley that took Dorothy's breath away. The natural amphitheater was unlike anything she'd seen in 20 years of mountain exploration. Pristine meadows surrounded by granite walls with a crystal-clear stream flowing through the center. It was the kind of place that existed in wilderness dreams, untouched by human activity and perfect in its isolation. Buster led her directly to a massive boulder beside the stream, where Morrison's final cairn stood like an altar to the wilderness itself. But as Dorothy approached the stones, she heard something that made her heart sink, the distant roar of helicopters approaching from the valley below. Dalton wasn't just bringing ground equipment. He was conducting a full-scale aerial survey to locate exactly what she'd just found. The race for Morrison's treasure had begun in earnest, and Dorothy realized she was about to discover whether 90 years of patient waiting had prepared the mountains to protect their secrets from those who would destroy them for a profit. The helicopter's rotor wash scattered the morning mist as Dorothy crouched behind Morrison's final cairn, her heart pounding with the knowledge that discovery seemed inevitable. But Buster showed no fear of the approaching aircraft. Instead, he walked calmly to the boulder's base and began pawing at what appeared to be solid rock, his actions deliberate and focused despite the chaos approaching from above. Following his lead, Dorothy examined the boulder more carefully and discovered what Morrison's final letter had only hinted at. The entire rock formation was artificial, a carefully constructed facade hiding the entrance to a natural cave system. The prospector had spent months camouflaging his discovery so thoroughly that even from a few feet away, the entrance remained invisible. Ingenious, Dorothy breathed, running her hands along the skillfully fitted stones. Morrison wasn't just hiding gold, he was protecting an entire underground landscape. As the helicopter circled overhead, Dorothy managed to locate the hidden mechanism Morrison had described in his letter. A specific sequence of pressure applied to certain stones caused a section of the facade to pivot inward, revealing a passage just large enough for a person and donkey to enter. The engineering was remarkable, suggesting that Morrison had possessed skills far beyond typical prospecting knowledge. Inside the cave, Dorothy's flashlight revealed wonders that made her gasp with amazement. Morrison hadn't just found gold. He'd discovered an underground cathedral carved by millions of years of water flow. Stalactites and flowstone formations created natural sculptures of breathtaking beauty, while an underground stream provided the musical soundtrack of flowing water echoing through hidden chambers. But what stopped Dorothy in her tracks wasn't the geological magnificence. It was Morrison's final cache of documents, carefully preserved in a metal container beside what appeared to be a natural stone table. These weren't mining records or treasure maps, but rather the detailed journals of a man whose discoveries had fundamentally changed his understanding of wealth itself. Morrison's true story emerged as Dorothy read through pages of careful handwriting by flashlight, with Buster standing patient guard at the cave entrance. Jake Morrison hadn't been a typical prospector at all, but rather a trained geologist and engineer who'd been hired by mining interests to survey the area for large-scale extraction potential. His initial discoveries had indeed revealed substantial gold deposits, but they'd also revealed something far more precious, an underground ecosystem of rare minerals and geological formations that would be destroyed by conventional mining. "I came here seeking fortune," Morrison had written, "but I found something far more valuable, a responsibility to protect what cannot be replaced. The gold is real, but extracting it would destroy formations that took millions of years to create. I cannot be the man who trades irreplaceable beauty for temporary wealth." The journal continued, with Morrison's growing environmental awakening decades ahead of its time. He'd realized that the underground chambers contained not just gold, but also rare mineral specimens, unique geological formations, and even evidence of ancient indigenous ceremonial use. The cave system was essentially a natural museum of geological and cultural history that industrial mining would obliterate in days. "I have decided to hide rather than exploit my discovery," Morrison had written in his final entry. "The markers I leave will guide someone worthy to this place, but the true treasure lies in understanding that some things are more valuable when left undisturbed. Let whoever follows these signs prove themselves worthy of this responsibility." But Morrison's most shocking revelation came in his final letter, sealed separately and marked, "For the one who completes the journey." Dorothy's hands trembled as she read his ultimate confession. He hadn't abandoned his claim because of environmental concerns alone, but because he'd discovered that the gold deposits extended far beyond his legal boundaries, encompassing sacred indigenous sites that would be desecrated by mining operations. "I have learned that this valley was considered sacred by the original inhabitants," Morrison had written. "The gold lies beneath ceremonial grounds that were used for vision quests and spiritual ceremonies for countless generations. I cannot profit from destroying what others held sacred, even if the law gives me the right to do so." Morrison's moral awakening had led him to a radical decision. Instead of filing for expanded mining claims, he'd contacted tribal representatives and offered to help them establish legal protection for the sacred sites. But his efforts had been cut short by the harsh winter that claimed his life, leaving his environmental vision unrealized for nearly a century. The implications hit Dorothy like a physical blow. This wasn't just about protecting wilderness from industrial exploitation. It was about honoring indigenous rights and sacred lands that predated any mining claims by thousands of years. Morrison's hidden treasure was actually evidence of a moral revolution that had been waiting 90 years for someone to continue his work. Outside the cave, the helicopter had landed in the meadow, and Dorothy could hear voices approaching through the forest. Rick Dalton's crew was conducting a systematic search of the area, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to locate Morrison's cache. But they were looking for gold deposits, not understanding that the real treasure was the cave system itself and the responsibility that came with its discovery. Buster's soft nicker drew Dorothy's attention to something she'd initially missed, a series of pictographs on the cave walls, painted with natural pigments and depicting ceremonies involving the underground chambers. The artwork was ancient but well preserved, confirming Morrison's discovery that this place had been sacred to indigenous peoples long before any European prospectors arrived. "My God," Dorothy whispered, understanding finally dawning. Morrison wasn't hiding stolen gold, he was protecting a sacred site. And now I have to decide whether to honor his vision or let it be destroyed. The voices outside grew closer, and Dorothy realized she had only minutes before Dalton's crew discovered the hidden entrance. Morrison's journals made clear that the gold was real and valuable, probably worth millions in today's market. But extracting it would require destroying irreplaceable geological formations and desecrating sacred indigenous sites that deserve protection, not exploitation. In that moment, crouched in an underground cathedral with a 50-cent donkey who'd somehow known exactly where to lead her, Dorothy understood what Morrison had realized 90 years earlier. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the responsibility to protect what couldn't be replaced. The choice facing her wasn't between poverty and riches, but between honoring the wisdom of the past and repeating the mistakes that had already damaged too much of the natural world. Buster pressed against her leg, offering silent support for whatever decision she would make. Looking into his intelligent eyes, Dorothy felt certain that Morrison's spirit had somehow guided her to this moment, trusting her to complete the work he'd started. The question was whether she possessed the courage to follow his example, even if it meant walking away from more money than she'd ever dreamed of having. The sound of metal detectors grew louder outside, and Dorothy knew her time for decision was running out. In her hands, she held evidence of gold deposits worth millions, along with Morrison's moral testament about the true cost of extraction. Whatever choice she made in the next few minutes would determine not just her own future, but the fate of a sacred landscape that had been waiting nearly a century for someone worthy of its protection. Dorothy's decision crystallized with sudden clarity as the voices outside grew closer. Morrison had spent his final months creating a test, not of greed or determination, but of wisdom and moral courage. The elaborate trail of markers hadn't been designed to lead treasure hunters to gold, but to guide the right person toward understanding what truly mattered. She carefully returned Morrison's journals to their protective container, but kept his final letter, the proof she would need for what came next. "We're getting out of here, Buster," she whispered, "but we're not running away. We're going to finish what Morrison started." The cave system was more extensive than she'd initially realized. Morrison's maps showed multiple passages and exits, including one that emerged nearly a mile away in a dense grove of aspens. The prospector had planned for exactly this situation, a way to escape unseen while leaving his treasure protected from those who would destroy it for profit. Navigating the underground passages by flashlight required careful attention to Morrison's hand-drawn maps, but Buster seemed to understand the route instinctively. Perhaps it was the same inherited knowledge that had led him to the original markers, or perhaps he could sense the air currents that indicated passages to the surface. Either way, his confidence in the darkness gave Dorothy courage to continue through passages that would have terrified her under normal circumstances. They emerged into morning sunlight nearly an hour later, concealed by the aspen grove and completely hidden from Dalton's search operation. From this position, Dorothy could see the full scope of the industrial invasion. Dozers had already begun clearing trees around the original cairn site, while teams with metal detectors were conducting grid searches of the entire valley floor. The sight strengthened her resolve. Morrison had feared exactly this kind of exploitation, and his worst nightmares were being realized in real time. But unlike the prospector who'd worked alone in the 1930s, Dorothy had access to modern communication and legal resources that could stop the destruction before it went too far. Her first call was to Linda, explaining the situation with the urgency it demanded. "I need you to contact the State Historical Society immediately. Tell them we've discovered documented evidence of Native American sacred sites that are being threatened by illegal mining activity. I'm sending you photographs of the cave paintings right now." Linda's accountant mind immediately grasped the legal implications. "Dorothy, if you can prove indigenous ceremonial use, that changes everything. Federal law requires consultation with tribal representatives before any disturbing activity can take place on sacred sites, even on public land. How long will that process take? Days at minimum, weeks more likely, but you need official documentation from recognized tribal authorities. Do you have any idea which tribes use that area historically?" Dorothy consulted Morrison's journals, finding his careful notes about tribal representatives he'd contacted in the 1930s. He mentions the Southern Ute and the Jicarilla Apache. Morrison believed the cave was used for vision quests and coming-of-age ceremonies. Perfect. I'm calling both tribal councils immediately. They'll have legal standing to request an emergency injunction if their sacred sites are being threatened, while Linda worked the legal angles. Dorothy's next call was to Tom Bradley, the Forest Service ranger who'd helped her with previous research. Bradley's response was immediate and reassuring. He'd been concerned about Dalton's survey activities for weeks, but hadn't had grounds for intervention until now. "Dorothy, what you're describing is exactly what we needed. If Dalton's crews are operating without proper permits in areas of cultural significance, I can shut them down immediately pending environmental and cultural impact assessments. How quickly can you get there? I'm 20 minutes out. Keep me posted on your location. And whatever you do, stay away from the active work sites. Some of Dalton's people have been pretty aggressive with anyone who questions their activities." Dorothy's final call was to the local newspaper. Knowing that public attention would provide protection, her small legal team might not be able to guarantee. The environmental reporter was fascinated by the story of Morrison's hidden conservation legacy and promised to have a photographer at the site within hours. "This is exactly the kind of story our readers care about," the reporter assured her. "Local history, environmental protection, indigenous rights. It hits every angle that matters to our community." From her concealed position in the Aspens, Dorothy watched Dalton's operation with growing satisfaction as her allies began to respond. The first Forest Service vehicle arrived just as the dozers were preparing to remove Morrison's original cairn. Bradley's intervention was swift and decisive. All machinery was ordered to cease operation immediately pending permit verification and environmental review. But Rick Dalton wasn't giving up easily. Dorothy could see him arguing with Bradley, gesturing angrily at the equipment and the partially cleared forest. When the tribal representatives arrived, two elderly men who examined the cave paintings with reverent attention, Dalton's frustration became visible even from a distance. The newspaper photographer documented everything. The illegal clearing operation, the tribal elders examining sacred sites, the sophisticated cave system that industrial mining would have destroyed. Each photograph strengthened the case for permanent protection of Morrison's discovery. As the day progressed, Dorothy felt increasingly confident that Morrison's vision could finally be realized. The legal framework existed to protect sacred indigenous sites. The environmental laws were strong enough to prevent destructive mining in sensitive ecosystems. The public support was overwhelming once people understood what was at stake. but her satisfaction was tempered by watching Dalton's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage his operation. His crews were still conducting surveys in areas beyond Bradley's immediate jurisdiction, and his legal team was filing emergency appeals to overturn the work stoppage. Most concerning, some of his equipment operators seemed more interested in Dorothy's location than in packing up their machinery. "They know I have Morrison's maps," Dorothy realized, watching through binoculars as several men examined the area where she and Buster had emerged from the cave system. "They're not giving up. They're trying to find another way in." Buster's behavior confirmed her concerns. The donkey was increasingly agitated, his ears constantly moving to track sounds that Dorothy couldn't hear. When she followed his gaze toward the forest, she caught glimpses of movement that suggested they were being watched by people who didn't want to be seen. By late afternoon, Dorothy had assembled a formidable coalition of allies, tribal representatives, Forest Service officials, environmental lawyers, and media attention that was growing by the hour. Morrison's century-old dream of protecting the Sacred Valley was closer to reality than it had ever been. But as evening approached, and most of the official observers began to leave, Dorothy realized that the real confrontation was just beginning. Dalton's people were still in the area, and they knew she possessed the key to accessing Morrison's treasure. The legal protection was solid, but not yet permanent, and there were still hours of darkness ahead when anything could happen. "Tomorrow we make this official," she told Buster as they prepared to spend the night in the aspen grove, rather than returning to her potentially compromised cabin. "Tomorrow we turn Morrison's hidden valley into a protected sacred site that no one can ever destroy. But first, they had to survive a night in the wilderness with people who had millions of dollars at stake and no apparent respect for legal boundaries." Dorothy checked her emergency supplies and made sure her phone was fully charged for whatever challenges the darkness might bring. Morrison had protected his discovery for 90 years. Now it was her turn to prove worthy of that legacy, no matter what it cost her. The attack came just after midnight, when Dorothy was dozing fitfully against her backpack with Buster standing guard nearby. The donkey's urgent braying jolted her awake, seconds before powerful flashlight beams pierced the darkness around their hidden campsite. 3 men emerged from the forest, moving with military precision, their faces obscured by night vision equipment that gave them a significant advantage in the darkness. "Mrs. Camden," the lead figure called out in a voice she recognized as Rick Dalton's, "we need to have a conversation about those maps you found. My legal team says you're trespassing on land my company has legitimate survey rights to explore." Dorothy's heart hammered as she struggled to her feet, putting herself between the approaching men and Buster. Her phone showed no signal. They were too deep in the wilderness for reliable communication. Exactly what Dalton had been counting on. "Your surveys were conducted without proper permits," Dorothy called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "The Forest Service has already shut down your operation pending environmental review." Dalton's laugh carried no humor. "Temporary setback, nothing more. My lawyers are filing appeals in federal court tomorrow morning, and they're confident we'll have full authorization to proceed within days. But that timeline depends on having access to all relevant historical documentation, including Morrison's original maps. I've already turned everything over to the tribal representatives and the Historical Society." "You're wasting your time." "I don't think so." Dalton stepped closer, and Dorothy could see his face clearly in the reflected flashlight beams. "You see, Mrs. Camden, I've done my research too. Morrison's claim may have been abandoned legally, but his geological surveys were remarkably accurate. The gold deposits he documented are worth at least $3 million at current market prices, possibly much more." Dorothy forced herself to remain calm, despite the growing menace in Dalton's tone. "And you think that gives you the right to destroy sacred indigenous sites? To level an entire ecosystem for profit? I think it gives me the right to pursue legitimate business opportunities on public land, using proper legal channels and environmental safeguards. What you call destruction, I call responsible resource development that creates jobs and generates tax revenue for the community." Buster moved closer to Dorothy, his body language tense and protective. In the darkness beyond the flashlight beams, Dorothy could hear other sounds, more footsteps, the crackle of radio communications, the systematic movement of people surrounding their position. "How many men did you bring?" Dorothy asked, stalling for time while her mind raced through options for escape. "Enough to ensure we can have an uninterrupted conversation about our mutual interests," Dalton replied. "You see, Mrs. Camden, I'm not the villain in this story. I'm offering you a partnership opportunity that could benefit everyone involved." "What kind of partnership?" "You help me access Morrison's cash, and I'll guarantee that 20% of the profits go directly to environmental protection programs. We'll establish a foundation for wilderness preservation, fund tribal cultural programs, even build a visitor center to educate people about the area's history." The offer was sophisticated, designed to appeal to her environmental concerns while still achieving Dalton's primary objective. But Dorothy had read Morrison's journals carefully enough to understand that any mining operation, no matter how responsible, would destroy the delicate underground ecosystem irreparably. "Morrison spent months studying that cave system," Dorothy replied. "He understood that the geological formations took millions of years to develop and couldn't be replaced once destroyed. No amount of money can compensate for that kind of loss." Morrison was a Depression-era prospector with limited scientific knowledge, Dalton countered. "Modern mining techniques are far more precise and environmentally sensitive. We can extract the gold deposits while preserving the most significant geological features. And the sacred indigenous sites? The ceremonial chambers with paintings that predate European contact by centuries? Protected and preserved as part of the visitor center experience. Tourism revenue from the historical site could actually exceed the value of the gold extraction over time." Dorothy felt a flicker of doubt. Dalton's proposal sounded reasonable, even progressive, compared to typical mining operations. But something in his tone suggested that environmental protection was a negotiating position rather than a genuine commitment. Buster's sudden movement broke the tense standoff. The donkey stepped forward and placed himself directly between Dorothy and Dalton, his small body radiating a protective energy that surprised everyone present. In that moment, Dorothy realized that her 50-cent rescue was prepared to defend Morrison's legacy with the same determination that had guided their journey from the beginning. "I need time to consider your proposal," Dorothy said carefully. "These decisions shouldn't be made under pressure in the middle of the night." "Unfortunately, time is something we don't have," Dalton replied, his false reasonableness finally dropping away. "My legal team needs those maps by morning to include them in our federal court filing. Either you cooperate voluntarily, or we'll have to explore other options for accessing the information we need." The threat was clear, and Dorothy understood that her peaceful mountain life was about to become very complicated indeed. Dorothy's moment of decision was interrupted by an unexpected sound, the distant rumble of approaching vehicles echoing through the forest. Dalton's head snapped toward the noise, his confident demeanor faltering as multiple sets of headlights became visible through the trees. "Sir," one of his men reported through the radio, "we've got Forest Service, tribal police, and what looks like media vehicles coming up the main access road. Multiple units moving fast." Linda had obviously been busy during the afternoon, coordinating a response that was arriving with perfect timing. Dorothy felt a surge of gratitude toward her practical sister, whose accountant's mind had apparently grasped the urgency of the situation better than anyone. "You called in reinforcements," Dalton accused, his voice tight with anger. "This was supposed to be a private business discussion. You brought armed men to threaten a woman camping alone in the wilderness," Dorothy replied, finding courage in the approaching help. "I'd say the situation escalated well beyond private business discussion. The first vehicle to reach their location was Tom Bradley's Forest Service truck, followed closely by 2 tribal police units and a van with Channel 7 News logos. Dorothy had never been so happy to see artificial lights piercing the mountain darkness. Bradley, emerged from his truck with the calm authority of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations in wilderness settings. Good evening, folks. We received reports of unauthorized nighttime activities in a restricted area. I'm going to need everyone to step back and explain what's happening here. Ranger Bradley, Dalton said, switching immediately to his businessman persona. There seems to be some confusion about survey boundaries and access rights. My legal team will have this straightened out by morning. Actually, Mr. Dalton, your legal team will be dealing with federal charges for intimidating witnesses and interfering with an active cultural preservation investigation, replied Joseph Yazzie, the tribal police chief who emerged from the second vehicle. We've been monitoring your radio communications. For the past hour, Dorothy realized that the cavalry hadn't arrived by accident. They'd been tracking Dalton's movements and had probably heard enough of the confrontation to understand exactly what was happening. Modern law enforcement had resources that Morrison could never have imagined, and they were being used to protect the same sacred sites the prospector had died trying to preserve. Mrs. Camden, Chief Yazzie continued, our tribal historians have confirmed that the cave system you discovered contains some of the most significant ceremonial artwork in our traditional territory. Federal law is very clear about protecting such sites from any kind of disturbance. The news photographer was documenting everything, flash bulbs illuminating the surreal scene of armed confrontation in the wilderness. Dorothy realized that tomorrow's newspaper would tell the story of Morrison's conservation legacy in a way that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore. Chief Yazzie, I have something that belongs to your people, Dorothy said, reaching carefully into her backpack to retrieve Morrison's final letter. Jake Morrison wrote this in 1932, explaining why he couldn't profit from mining operations that would destroy ceremonial sites. He wanted tribal representatives to know about the sacred chambers. Chief Yazzie read Morrison's letter by flashlight, his expression growing more solemn with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at Dorothy with something approaching reverence. This prospector understood what many modern people still don't grasp, the chief said. Some places are too sacred to be measured in money. Morrison was trying to return stewardship of this site to its rightful guardians, which is exactly what we're going to do, Dorothy replied. Morrison left detailed documentation of everything he found, including maps of the cave system and photographs of the ceremonial artwork. It's all being donated to the Tribal Cultural Center, along with legal documentation establishing permanent protection for the entire area. Dalton's face showed defeat as he realized that his million-dollar mining operation had just become a federally protected cultural site. You people don't understand what you're throwing away. That gold could fund community development for decades. Mr. Dalton, Chief Yazzie replied with quiet dignity, our people have been wealthy in the ways that matter for thousands of years. We don't need to destroy sacred places to understand our own value. The confrontation that had seemed so threatening just minutes earlier dissolved into routine police procedure as Dalton and his men were escorted away for questioning. Dorothy watched the taillights disappear down the mountain road, feeling like she'd just witnessed the final chapter of Morrison's century-long struggle to protect what couldn't be replaced. Mom, Bradley said as the immediate crisis passed, you've done something remarkable here. Morrison's discovery will become one of the most significant protected cultural sites in the region. Your actions tonight probably saved irreplaceable artifacts that would have been destroyed by morning. Standing in the forest clearing with Buster pressed against her side, Dorothy felt the weight of the past 90 years settling into peace. Morrison's vision had finally been realized, not through the actions of mining companies or government agencies, but through the simple compassion of a woman who'd paid 50 cents for a donkey nobody else wanted. The treasure had been found, protected, and returned to its rightful guardians, exactly as Morrison had dreamed. 1 year later, Dorothy stood at the entrance to the Morrison Sacred Site Visitor Center, watching as tribal elders led a group of school children toward the cave system that had remained hidden for 90 years. The transformation of the remote valley was remarkable. not through industrial development, but through respectful preservation that honored both the natural landscape and its cultural significance. The visitor center had been built using traditional indigenous design principles, with materials that complemented rather than competed with the surrounding wilderness. Solar panels provided electricity, geothermal systems handled heating and cooling, and the entire structure seemed to grow naturally from the landscape rather than imposing upon it. Native plants surrounded the building, creating a seamless transition between architecture and environment that would have made Morrison proud. Dorothy called Chief Yazzie as he approached with the morning's tour group. "The children are hoping Buster will be available for the nature walk today." She looked toward the meadow where Buster grazed contentedly, his coat now glossy from good nutrition and regular veterinary care. The donkey had become something of a celebrity since the story of his remarkable navigation skills had spread through environmental and indigenous rights circles. Visitors came from across the country hoping to meet the animal whose instincts had led to one of the most significant cultural preservation discoveries in recent decades. "I think he'd enjoy that," Dorothy replied, watching Buster raise his head at the sound of children's voices. "He's always been good with young people." The transformation in Dorothy's own life had been equally dramatic, though in ways she could never have anticipated. When she'd first knelt beside a scrawny donkey in Miller's feed store, the Morrison Foundation, established with grants from environmental organizations and cultural preservation societies, had hired her as its first director, recognizing that her geological knowledge and deep connection to the area made her uniquely qualified to oversee the site's protection. Her new role provided financial security she'd never expected, but more importantly, it gave her life a sense of purpose that had been missing since Frank's death. Every day brought new visitors eager to learn about Morrison's conservation legacy, about indigenous cultural traditions, and about the delicate underground ecosystem that industrial mining would have destroyed forever. The legal resolution had been swift once federal authorities became involved. Dalton Construction had faced significant fines for operating without proper permits and for attempting to intimidate witnesses in a federal cultural preservation case. Rick Dalton himself had been banned from conducting any mining operations on public land for 10 years, effectively ending his company's expansion plans in the region. But the real victory had been the establishment of the Morrison Sacred Site as a permanent cultural preserve, managed jointly by the Forest Service and tribal authorities. The designation protected not just the cave system, but the entire watershed that fed the underground streams, ensuring that the delicate mineral formations would remain undisturbed for future generations. Mrs. Camden, one of the visiting schoolchildren, asked as they prepared for the nature walk, "Is it true that Buster can find things that people can't see?" Dorothy smiled, remembering her own skepticism just a year ago. "Buster has very good instincts about the mountains. Animals often notice things that humans miss. Sounds, smells, changes in the environment that help them navigate. But how did he know where to find the treasure?" The question had been asked hundreds of times by journalists, researchers, and curious visitors. Dorothy had developed a standard response that satisfied most people while preserving some of the mystery that made Buster's story so compelling. "I think Buster understood something that took me much longer to learn," she said, watching the donkey approach the group with his characteristic calm dignity. "The real treasure wasn't gold or money. It was discovering something precious that needed protection. Buster led me to Morrison's markers because he somehow knew they would guide us to something worth preserving." The afternoon tour took visitors through the cave system using carefully designed walkways that allowed access without damaging the formations. Dorothy never tired of watching people's faces as they encountered the underground cathedral for the first time, the same sense of awe and reverence she'd felt that first morning when Buster had led her through Morrison's hidden entrance. The cave paintings remained the most moving part of the tour, with tribal guides explaining the spiritual significance of the ceremonies that had taken place in these chambers for countless generations. Morrison's metal container still sat on the stone table where he'd left it, now protected behind museum-quality glass, but still visible as testimony to one man's moral awakening. Jake Morrison could have become very wealthy from his discovery, Dorothy explained to each tour group. Instead, he chose to protect what couldn't be replaced. His decision to hide rather than exploit his find preserved not just gold, but an irreplaceable piece of cultural and natural history. As evening approached and the day's visitors departed, Dorothy walked with Buster through the meadow where Morrison's original cabin had stood. A small monument now marked the spot, bearing an inscription that summarized the prospector's legacy. He found gold, but chose to preserve something more precious. The Morrison Foundation's success had exceeded everyone's expectations. Educational programs brought thousands of students to the site each year, teaching them about environmental stewardship and cultural preservation. Research partnerships with universities were documenting the cave's unique ecosystem, while archaeological studies continued to reveal new understanding of indigenous ceremonial practices. The irony wasn't lost on Dorothy, that her 50-cent investment in an unwanted donkey had led to discoveries worth millions, not in extracted wealth, but in preserved heritage and protected wilderness. The Foundation's annual budget exceeded anything she could have earned in her previous life, funded by donations from people who understood that some treasures were more valuable when left in the ground. "You know what the best part is, Buster?" she said, stroking his neck as they watched the sun set behind the peaks that had hidden Morrison's secret for 90 years. Frank would have loved all of this. He always said the mountains had more stories to tell than we had time to hear. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Saw the PBS documentary about the Morrison site. Mom and Dad would be so proud of what you've accomplished. When you're ready for the next adventure, there's a story about abandoned mining claims in Utah that might interest the Foundation." Dorothy laughed, imagining more adventures waiting in the wilderness, more hidden treasures that needed protection rather than exploitation. The work Morrison had started was far from finished. Across the American West, countless sites remained vulnerable to industrial development that prioritized profit over preservation. Martha from the courthouse had become a regular volunteer at the visitor center, sharing her encyclopedic knowledge of local history with fascinated tourists. Tom Bradley had been promoted within the Forest Service, largely based on his innovative approach to protecting cultural sites while maintaining public access. Even Jake Miller had benefited from the Morrison discovery. His feed store now sold Morrison site souvenirs and camping supplies to the steady stream of visitors, providing economic benefits to Millbrook that were sustainable rather than extractive. The town that had once mocked Dorothy for wasting 50 cents on a scrawny donkey now celebrated her as their most famous resident. As autumn colors painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Dorothy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Grief over Frank's death had led her to rescue Buster, and that simple act of compassion had revealed possibilities she never could have imagined. The mourning widow, who'd felt lost and purposeless, had become a respected conservationist whose work would protect irreplaceable treasures for generations to come. But tonight, in this protected valley where ancient ceremonies had been conducted and where one prospector's moral courage had created a lasting legacy, Dorothy felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've done something that matters. She'd rescued a donkey nobody wanted and discovered that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. In the gathering darkness, Buster lifted his head toward the mountains, alert and attentive as always. Perhaps somewhere in the wilderness, another hidden treasure was waiting for someone wise enough to understand that the greatest wealth comes not from what we take from the earth, but from what we choose to protect for those who will follow in our footsteps. The mountains kept their secrets well, but Dorothy had learned to trust that when the time was right, The right person would always be led to discover what needed to be found. And sometimes that person would be guided by a 50-cent donkey with wisdom far beyond his humble appearance.